The year was 1922. Germany was a nation gasping for air. The Great War had ended, but peace had not arrived. Instead, it brought the suffocating weight of hyperinflation and the Treaty of Versailles. In the cities, people burned stacks of worthless marks just to stay warm. In the countryside, the social fabric was fraying. Political factions clashed in the streets, and a sense of profound hopelessness hung over the landscape like a shroud. It was against this backdrop of desperation that we find the farmstead of Hinterkaifeck. The name itself sounds like a jagged blade, Hinterkaifeck. Literally, it means behind Kaifeck, the small village that served as its nearest neighbor. Nestled in the idyllic but lonely hill country of Bavaria, about 40 miles from Munich, the farm was a cluster of timber and stone huddled against the edge of a dense, dark forest. To a stranger, it might have looked like a portrait of rural peace. To those who lived there, it was becoming a prison. The Gruber family were not well loved. Andreas, the 63-year-old patriarch, was known as a hard, reclusive man. He lived there with his 72-year-old wife, Cecilia, and their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel. 2 children filled the halls with the only life the farm knew, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph. But the house held a darkness deeper than mere reclusion. Whispers of incest followed Andreas and his daughter Victoria wherever they went, rumors that Andreas was the true father of little Joseph. It was a home built on secrets, isolated by choice and by the judgment of the community. On March 31st, a new face arrived, Maria Baumgartner, a 44-year-old maid. She was a replacement for the previous servant who had fled the farm 6 months earlier. Why did she leave? She claimed the house was haunted. She spoke of phantom footsteps and a presence that watched from the corners of the rooms. Maria arrived at Hinterkaifeck on a Friday. By Friday night, she would be dead. In the days leading up to the end, the haunting began to take a physical, terrifying shape. Andreas Gruber, a man not given to flights of fancy, began to tell his neighbors of strange occurrences. First, the footprints. After a fresh snowfall, Andreas found tracks emerging from the forest, leading straight toward the farm buildings. He followed them with a heavy heart, expecting to find a trespasser. But the tracks stopped at the wall of the house. There were no return prints leading back to the woods. Whatever had walked out of the trees was now inside the perimeter. Then came the sounds, heavy, rhythmic thuds in the attic, as if something large was pacing above their heads. Andreas searched the crawl spaces, weapon in hand, but found nothing. Then a newspaper appeared on the porch, a paper from the city that no one in the family had purchased. Finally, the house keys vanished. One by one, the larks of Hinterkaifeck became useless. The family was trapped in an open house, waiting for a guest who had already moved in. On the night of March 31st, the silence of the Bavarian woods was broken. We can only reconstruct the horror through the carnage left behind. It began in the barn. One by one, perhaps lured by a noise or a flickering light, 4 members of the family were drawn from the house. First Andreas, then his wife Cecilia, then Victoria, and finally young 7-year-old Cecilia. As each stepped into the darkness of the barn, they were met by a shadow wielding a mattock, a heavy, sharpened pickaxe. The killer was precise. Each victim was struck with devastating force, their skulls crushed by the iron blade. The young girl, Cecilia, did not die instantly. Evidence later suggested she lay in the straw for hours, tearing out clumps of her own hair in a state of terminal shock. The killer then moved to the house. He found Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, in her bedchamber. She was killed before she could even begin her new life. Finally, the shadow reached the nursery. There in his crib lay 2-year-old Joseph. With one final, cold swing of the mattock, the lineage of the Grubers was extinguished. The most chilling chapter of the Hinterkaifeck mystery is not the murders themselves, but the 4 days that followed. The bodies lay in the barn and the nursery, cooling in the spring chill. But the farm did not go dark. Neighbors saw smoke curling from the chimney. They saw the cattle being tended to and the cows being milked. Someone had sat in the kitchen and eaten the family's bread and meat. Someone had used the fireplace to ward off the night air. For nearly 100 hours, the killer lived as a phantom occupant of the farm. He slept in their beds, fed their animals, and walked the halls where the blood was still wet. He was a ghost in a house of his own making. It wasn't until April 4th that the neighbors, concerned by the uncollected mail and the absence of the children at school, forced their way inside. The investigation that followed was a chaotic blend of early forensics and desperate superstition. The police questioned over 100 suspects. They looked at Lawrence Schlittenbauer, a local man and suitor of Victoria, who many suspected was the father of Joseph. They even entertained the theory that Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, had not died in the trenches of World War, but had returned as a vengeful wraith to reclaim his home. In a move that sounds like a scene from a Poe story, the local authorities eventually grew so desperate that they sent the victims' heads to Munich. There, the skulls were handed over to clairvoyants in the hope that the dead might speak from the beyond and name their killer. The psychics were silent. The skulls were eventually lost during the chaos of the Second World War, leaving the victims to be buried headless in a local plot. In 1923, the farmstead of Hinterkaifeck was razed to the ground. The neighbors wanted it gone, scrubbed from the earth as if the soil itself was tainted. During the demolition, the murder weapon was finally found, hidden beneath the floorboards of the attic where the haunting footsteps had first been heard. The case eventually went cold, buried under the rubble of the Nazi rise to power, the Second World War, and the Cold War. But the mystery refused to stay buried. In 2007, a group of students at a German police academy used modern criminal profiling and remaining evidence to re-examine the case. Using 21st century techniques, they reached a conclusion. They identified a prime suspect, a man who had the motive, the opportunity, and the knowledge of the farm to commit such a deed. However, out of respect for the living descendants of this individual, the name has never been released to the public. And so, Hinterkaifeck remains a known secret. The farm is gone now, replaced by a simple shrine in an open field. But when the wind blows from the forest toward the village of Kaifeck, the locals still remember. They remember the footprints in the snow that only led one way. They remember the smoke from the chimney of a dead house. And they remember that sometimes the most terrifying thing a man can encounter is the shadow that waits in his own attic, holding the keys he thought he had lost.